Okay, good morning, everybody. How is everybody doing? Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers and to everybody who has a mother or had a mother. You're a mother, beautiful. Happy Mother's Day.
I'm receiving presents.
You're on the receiving end. Okay, good. All right, we started talking about Haman. So we were saying that if the identity of Yehudi, if the identity of the Jew, Mordechai being Ish Yehudi, the officer of the Yehudi, of the Jew, is the idea of taking, is the idea of alignment, the inner alignment to access, to awaken within the Jew the inherent connection that they have with God, to prioritize God over their own self-interests. So what is the counter to that? The counter to that, because everything has a counter force, the counter to that is Haman. And what is Haman? So we shared the story of how Haman came to the king, desiring to request of the king to have Mordechai hung from the gallows, and the alignment, the events aligned that he came right when the king was wondering who to honor, how to honor Mordechai, who had saved the king's life. And when the king said to him, to whom, what should be done to the one that the king wishes to honor, the Megillah tells us that Haman said to himself, who would the king want to honor more than me? In other words, when one thinks that they are the center of the universe and everything revolves around them, then that is the identity of Haman, right? It's the counter to Mordechai that thinks that everything is about God. Haman thinks everything's about them. If you look at the bottom of page 50, he quotes a verse from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, that says, I and nothing else but me. It's a reference to Nebuchadnezzar, who said, he said, Li oiriv ani asisini, to me the river and nothing else. There's this notion that I and nothing but me, right? In English, we call that a narcissist in the extreme, right? A narcissist really believes that, without diagnosing the narcissist doesn't really have capacity to see anybody else but themselves. That's the nature of the narcissist. It's actually in the DSM, right? Whatever that stands for, the directory of something.
Diagnostic and statistical manual.
Thank you, doctor. So a narcissist is someone who basically doesn't have the capacity to see anybody other than themselves, and everybody else is just there in some way to serve them, which, as we said, that's actually really holy when the end game is serving God, right? If I recognize that my whole identity is to serve God, and everybody and everything was put into the world for me so that I can serve God, that becomes a really holy interaction. But if the nature of that attitude is that the sun really rises and sets on my, whatchamacallit, then we got a problem. Good morning. Then we got a problem. And that's what Haman is. Now, where does Haman come from? Who knows? Amalek. Amalek was the nation that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they attacked the Jews, knowing that they were going to get burned. The analogy that's given is of a hot bath. Right? You ever fill up the bath and the water is just a little bit too hot? Or you're going out with friends and there's a hot tub or a sauna that's just too hot. So one person has the sacrifice, they jump in, they get burned a little bit, but then the water cools down. So that's what Amalek did. Amalek knew they were going to get burned. There was no way that after the miracles that were performed for the Jewish people, they weren't going to get burned. But they decided to risk it anyway, because in getting burned, they would open up the door for others to attack the Jews. And so it has been ever since. So that attitude is, my selfishness is so great, my self-centeredness is so great, that I'm even willing to hurt myself in the process. Right? You might say in modern terminology, for those of you that are familiar with an understanding of the world of addiction, The addict lives in that space where they hurt themselves. Every time they use, they hurt themselves. But they're so preoccupied with getting their pleasure or their needs met. And we understand on a more psychological level that there's a discomfort that they can't find any peace with other than through using. So that's why they use, even though it's hurting them. What's the antidote to addiction, at least according to the principle of the 12 steps? Anybody? It's the first act. And the first act is an act of surrender. Basically, you let go of the notion of self and you say, there is something in its entirety that's greater than I am, which is God. And then you can begin a process of recovery. So Amalek is the antithesis to Mordechai, the Ish Yehudi, whose job is to awaken within the soul a consciousness, within the person, a consciousness that they are, that God is the only reality. Okay, so let's read a little bit about Amalek on page 51. So Haman was Ki Haya Mizera Amalek. He was from the descendants of Amalek. The story briefly with Amalek is that later on, during the times of King Saul, Saul was instructed. Apparently, there's a new TV show called David. Anybody see it? So in David, it tells the story of how the prophet Samuel, the prophet Shmuel, instructed Saul to destroy all of Amalek and their animals, their possessions, and the king saved the king of Amalek, whose name was Agag, and he also saved the choicest of their animals. And he saved the king because he had this notion that by saving the king, he would actually demonstrate to the king, who's the epitome of Amalek, God's greatness, that the Jewish people were victorious. And he saved the animals so that he can bring them as a sacrifice to God. But that wasn't what God instructed, right? We don't get to decide what God wants. We have to listen to what God wants. And the prophet says to them, because he didn't follow God's instruction, he also tore the prophet's cloak, his clothing. The prophet says, just as you have torn my clothing, so the kingdom will be torn from you. And then he quoted a verse and he said, Toiv mishmaya, Toiv lishmaya mizevach toiv. Forgetting the rest of the verse, but it's better to listen than a good sacrifice, right? Listening to God is better than a good sacrifice. So, but right before Agag was killed, or right before he was captured, he impregnated a woman who was able to therefore continue the Amalekite people, and ultimately Haman descended from this king. So, Ksiv, it says in the verse in Deuteronomy, it says, Reishas Goyim Amalek. Amalek is the head of the nations. Meaning, if you want to know about nations and their agenda with the Jews, you got to go to Amalek because he's the head of them. What does that mean? If we want to understand what are the nations, right? So there's in scripture, we have a notion of 7 nations. We say it in the prayers every day. Haknani, Hachiti, Amoiri, Aprize, Agagashi, Yevusi. These are the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hittites, and so on. All of these are nations. They were in the land of Israel when the Jewish people left Egypt, and when they entered into the land of Israel, their job was to conquer these 7 nations. Everything in the Torah is an instruction for us. So these aren't just 7 nations in the physical sense, they're also 7 nations in a spiritual sense. What are these 7 nations in the spiritual sense? So just for a moment, there's actually 10 nations. The other 3 nations, it says we will be transformed in the Messianic era. They were on the other side of the Jordan. But the job was to conquer the 7 nations. The 7 nations represent the nations that are within us. So we have 7 nations inside of ourselves and 3 nations, the intellectual nations, and our job is to conquer them. What does it mean to conquer them? To create transformation. What happens when you conquer? You take control. So within the 7 nations within us, we have these negative traits. The negative traits, the 7 emotional traits that are generally understood in the Sefirot, in the 10 building blocks of creation, which we discussed earlier in this course. The seven building blocks represent 7 emotional characteristics. And he translates them into their manifestation, which is desire, selfish desire, murder, and so on and so forth. So love, for example, is a selfless expression. The opposite of love is selfishness. So when I love myself and I do things that, when I only love myself, when I have selfish love, right? Today we talk about self-love, which is very noble. But when we talk about selfish love means that I'm going to do everything in my power to serve my needs. So that is the unhealthy, that is the negative quality of love, which ought to be in the service of others. I should be so preoccupied with my love for you that I'm ready to do whatever you need. Selfish love is I'm so preoccupied with the love for myself that I'm going to do whatever's in my interest. So these 7 nations need to be conquered. Va'amalek hu gasas haruach. Amalek is haughtiness, it's arrogance, it's that preoccupation with self. V'hu reishus lahem, and Amalek is the head of them being these 7 negative emotional characteristics. In other words, what is at the root of all negative characteristics? What is at the root of all negative behavior? You would say, which it comes from ego. You can cheat if you want. Haughtiness, right? The ego feeds the haughtiness, it feeds the arrogance, and because a person has that quality within them, when that is allowed to manifest, then it becomes dominant, and every negative character trait stems from there. As he says, the last line on the page, Ki gasos haruach hi shayrish kol amidas reis, for haughtiness is the source of all the undesirable emotional qualities. Even fear. Even fear. That's a good one. That's a good question. So let's say, give me an example of fear that might be a negative quality. How would you see fear as a negative quality? Or tell me how you see it as a positive quality.
Fear is a positive would be self-preservation. So don't build the dark forest, keep an eye on your kids, don't trust strangers right away. So those could be more of a defensive fear. But again, that stem of ignorance, can lead to fear turning into hatred.
So what happens when you get onto the diving board and you're afraid to jump into the pool? What do you say to yourself to jump into the pool? I can do it. I'll be okay. I'll be safe. Sometimes we encounter fear, and the fear is driven by, like you said, maybe ignorance. Ignorance is a harsh word. I would say the unknown, right? But if you have to go and do something, you're instructed to do something, or it's a moment that calls for your bravery, right? A family member's in danger or another person's in danger, and you have to go into that dark space, right? What do you have to do? You have to tell yourself that I have a greater calling and God is going to protect me and I have to do what I have to do. So when you allow the fear to feed your selfishness, then it becomes a negative. When despite the fear, or in the case of self-preservation, there's a building that has a fire and you don't go into the building because you're going to get burned in the building, right? So what's wrong with getting burned in the building? What's wrong with getting burned in the building is you're not going to be alive anymore. You're not going to be alive anymore. You're not going to be able to fulfill your purpose on this earth. So fear, by the way, all emotional characteristics inherently are neutral until we introduce either God or Amalek. If we introduce Amalek, then it becomes selfish. Love is a good thing, but love can become negative when I allow for that love to be towards myself without anchoring it, right? In other words, I kind of said it a little cynically that everybody's into self-love these days. you'll see today a lot of youth, they'll say, well, I can't do that because I have too much anxiety, or I need space for myself, right? It actually we'll use Mother's Day as an example of this. You can have a mother who says, I can't help you now because I need time for myself, right? Now, I don't know that a mother needs to ever articulate that, but we can debate that. But sometimes a mother does need time for herself, right? You need to charge yourself. You need to, if you're not in a good headspace, or you're not well rested and you're not well fed, it's very hard to show up for others. So a healthy mother says, you know what, I got to take a break. By the way, a healthy mother, healthy man. If you're gonna function in the world, I spoke to a rabbi last week. He called me up. He needed some advice, and I could tell he was in such a fight or flight kind of headspace. His life is overwhelmed. He's built a number of wonderful organizations that have impact thousands of people, and he just calls me up. I don't know what I'm doing in this world. What's my purpose? So I said to him, I have a bunch of questions. My first question is, when's the last time you took a vacation? It took him about 5 minutes to understand that whatever time he ever took for himself wasn't a vacation. Well, I went with my family here for Passover. I said, no, when did you take time for yourself? And in his selflessness, he hasn't done that. But in the process, he's also hurt himself, because you don't have the mindset to be there, especially if you're an influential person making an impact on the world. You've got to be healthy. You got to show up healthy. If you can't show up healthy, you're not serving the others. So this idea of taking space for myself can be very selfish, and it can be very selfless, right? In the act of serving others, I need to take time for myself so I can be a healthy person to show up, right? So it's all very subtle, but the question is, what's the driver? What's the driver? In other words, if we look at the 3 garments of the soul, which are thought, speech, and action, right? Action is the easiest to discern when it's right or wrong. If I'm doing something wrong or if I'm doing something right, that's clear. But then there's all the neutral, and most of our life is lived in the neutral space. Most of what we do in a given day is in the neutral space. We eat, we sleep, we go to work, we take care of the house, we take care of our bills. These are all neutral. There's nothing holy or unholy about it, right? When we get into speech, it becomes a little bit more difficult to discern. We had in yesterday's Torah portion, it says, before the blind, you should not put a stumbling block. I am Hashem, your God, or I am Hashem. And Rashi comments, why does it say I am Hashem? Because God says sometimes you can say something that to the outside individual seems like your intentions were good, but your intentions were not good. So therefore it says, I am Hashem, I'm God, I'm telling you, I know what's in your heart. I know if you have sinister agenda. And then when it comes to thought, it becomes even more difficult, because we're the first ones to convince ourselves that our thought process is normal and healthy, and that the way we're looking at the world is altruistic, right? You'll never find a narcissist that's going to tell you that they're doing something wrong, right? Because I'm so convinced that my perspective is right and that my intentions are genuine. So in the neutral space, it's very difficult to discern because it is neutral. So what makes this neutral space holy or unholy? It's whether you're following Mordechai or whether you're following Haman. Is this about God or is it about you? If it's about God, then it's holy. I'll tell you one other, and if it's about Haman, then it's unholy. I'll tell you one other beautiful teaching. I mentioned this yesterday at the Kiddush, that you have the idea in yesterday's Torah portion that you shouldn't make a cast image for yourself, right? So one can sometimes, so what happens? Each of us in life, we create cast images for ourselves. There are gods that we worship that compel behavior, unhealthy behavior. So your room needs to be set just so. People need to talk just so. People need to behave just so. And then you come at them and you say, you're not talking properly, you're not behaving properly, you're not following the structure. And it's all in the name of this God that you worship. But the truth is, it's just a God that you created. And if you stop and say, what's really important here? If we have the wherewithal to pause and say, why am I getting hung up on this? Then we leave space. Our gods don't need to be cast in silver or gold or in stone or in wood. They don't need to be cast in that. We have to be flexible. And that's why even very, very religious people also have a God cast in stone or wood or silver or gold. When they're inflexible and intolerant of others, then their God has also become cast in stone. And we have to have flexibility to move from that, because then it's not about God, it's about me. I worship the God that I created for myself. And the God that I created for myself is inflexible. No, that's not God. God is very flexible. God is very tolerant. God is very embracing. God has, look at the world God created. God has space for everybody in their religions. It doesn't mean that you're not worshiping the true God. And clearly there is a place and a line that we have to embrace, that we're not to cross. But that's when it comes down to the right and the wrong in the positive or negative actions. But in terms of an openness, we have to have that openness. And what allows for us to have that openness is whether we're serving God or we're serving ourselves. Does it make sense? Please, yeah.
As we, like me, as I feel older, 2 more years I'll be 80, it's hard for me to accept another opinion. I think, oh, I'm right. I have more experience than all these people. I believe it not. And it's harder to be flexible like that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation. I'll tell you what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says in ethics, it gives a timeline for what people's obligations are in life. At 5, we begin to study the Torah. I think it's 12, you begin to study Mishnah. 18, one is to get married. 20, one goes to pursue a livelihood, and so on and so forth. And it goes 20, 40, 30, 40, 50, the qualifications of each of these things. And then it says that when one reaches 100, ki'ilu meis va'avar ubatum min ha'olam. When you're 100, you're like dead, and you've passed from the world. It was like, okay, that's pretty harsh. So the Hasidic masters explain, what does that mean? What, we check people out at 100? I mean, we should all be fortunate to live to 100. But the Hasidic masters say that when a person turns 100, they no longer are stuck on all of this stuff. In other words, I don't mean to be crass, but the more you get to the finish line, the less the things in the world are that important. And one ought to, no criticism of you, ma'am, but as we get older, we ought to become more tolerant, at least in how we relate to others, because we realize that people are people and life has its journeys, and at the end of the day, everybody will find their way, right? And that God has space for everybody. And by the way, as a parent, that's the hardest thing to do, is to let go of controlling your children. And to say, you know what, they'll figure it out. They'll get there. It's a very difficult thing to do, but as we get older, when we're young, when the kids are younger, so we're afraid that if we don't manage them exactly so, they're going to turn into monsters, right? Somebody once told me, I was getting agitated when one of my kids or 2 of my kids were fighting. He said, don't worry, they won't be doing this under the chuppah. They'll figure it out between now and then, right? But then they become adults and they're leading their lives, and you have opinions about how they should lead their lives, and you want to help them out of the challenges they're facing, and you just got to keep your mouth shut, because they got to figure it out. They got to figure it out, and they will figure it out. And the more you believe that, the more they actually figure it out. All right. 52. Let's look just at the paragraph in the English at the top of the page. I'll just read it. Amalek, by contrast, is not associated with any particular quality, but rather with the approach of self-concern that lies at the core of all the attributes of the animal soul. That self-orientation must be eradicated entirely. It cannot be transformed. In other words, the selfishness, the self-centeredness can't be transformed, because the animal is an animal. You're never going to change an animal into something else. It's always going to be an animal. It's always going to be interested in self. So the selfishness, the self-orientation, the self-preoccupation has to be eradicated. And similarly, the wars against Amalek were never for conquest, and we are commanded to annihilate that nation entirely. There is no way of using anything associated with it for a positive purpose. Therefore, when King Saul thought of using the herds of Amalek as sacrifices, his initiative was rejected entirely by God. But the other nations, the other 7 nations, they are available for conquest. They're available for transformation. We have the capacity to transform the negative traits, the traits themselves. We can transform them into something positive. How? By changing the core. Go to the core of it, and then we can change the trait. Therefore, Haman, who is this haughtiness, his agenda was to destroy and annihilate all of the Jews. Why? Because they are the antithesis to Haman. Haman is about self-centeredness, and the core of the Jew, the Yehudim, right? As we mentioned, the Megillah doesn't call them Hebrews or something else, it calls them Yehudim. It identifies the Jew with their core faith, the ability to have the selfless connection with God. Haman wanted to eradicate that because that irritated him. Because it's the antithesis of who he is. Shein bechinas bittul. Hepech hayesh v'gasus is the opposite of self-concern and haughtiness. By the way, just for a moment to deviate, but very relevant, the anti-Semitism, right? One of the things that we've learned in the last 18 months is that the hatred that exists to the Jew is not rational. And those that are still holding on to that there's some solution to the hatred, if we only do this, if we only do that, the world will like us and at least they'll tolerate us, they're in La La Land. We thought that before October 7th, but it's very clear that that's not the way it is. It's just part and parcel with the function of humanity is that people are going to hate us. And you ask those very people why they hate us so much, they don't have an answer. So what is the hatred? The hatred is that at the core, the Jew, the identity of the Jew is the antithesis to the human condition. The human condition. I don't mean being a good human. The human condition, the way each of us come into this world, is a preoccupation with self. Look at a newborn baby, comes out of the womb crying, and until some point, the kid thinks that the whole world revolves around them. I'm hungry, cry. My diaper's dirty, cry. And scream and yell until someone comes and takes care of me. And then they become toddlers and they go through that same process. It looks different, but it's, you took my toy. I want that food. I want that candy. And I'm going to throw a tantrum until you give it to me. What is, that's nonsense. Just because you want something, you get it? Right? Imagine a 50-year-old man going into the supermarket and throws a tantrum because his wife tells him he shouldn't eat the candy. You'd say, what's wrong with you? You're a grown-up. You're an adult. Act like an adult. What are we saying? We say you want a candy. Not everything you want do you get. Not everything that you want you should have. But tell that to a kid, you're not talking to anybody. There's no one home because you're talking to an animal. God forbid an animal. You're talking to the animal soul. And the animal soul has a one-track consciousness. Me, 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 me. What's supposed to happen is as we mature, we realize, oh, there's something more than me. There's a world out there. There's a God out there. There's a purpose out there, right? But there's a part of us that continues to want to be served. By the way, all of our emotional triggers have to do with this as well. Whenever someone rubs us the wrong way, it's just selfishness. It's a preoccupation with self. Again, we can analyze that, and it's not as ugly as the kid throwing a tantrum, although sometimes it is, but it's just an adult version of the same thing. So the nature of the human, the animal human, the human condition is that I want to be left to my own things. Let me do whatever I want. Along comes the Jew, the very identity of the Jew, which is the identity of this connection to God, that says, no, it's not about you. It's about God. We have a purpose on this earth. And that animal says, no, shut you down. Get rid of those Jews because they're my consciousness in front of my face. right? Try to harness an animal. Try to put a harness, a noose, something on an animal. They want to throw it off. So what do? You got to teach the animal. You got to teach the animal. It's not about you. You're here to serve. And if you don't listen, you'll get a kick in your side, or you'll get a whip on your back, or whatever it is. And then eventually the animal falls into line because it's an animal and it knows how to be obedient because it doesn't want to get hurt. And that's the beginning in our service of God. That's the first level of God. It's called Yirat Hata. The lower level of fear or awe of God is fear of punishment. It's an immature love, but it's what the animal sometimes needs. And Maimonides, in describing the process of education, says that we start with reward and punishment because that's what the animal understands. But that's not the end game. We shouldn't be a grown-up not stealing because we don't want to get in trouble. We shouldn't steal because it's wrong, it's immoral. Right? We should do the right thing because that's what God wants from us. Not because we're going to get a prize or popularity or whatever else it might be. So bottom of 52, nonetheless, despite the fact that this was Haman's agenda, that he wanted to eradicate the Jewish people. I'm sorry, I skipped a few lines before. If the Jews, if the Yehudim denied their Jewishness, God forbid, they would have been exempted from the decree. Because the decree, the decree was against the Yehudim. It was against the Jewish identity. But all of them as one. During the time of the decree, not one Jew had an outside thought to abandon their Jewishness. They sacrificed themselves. They were prepared to sacrifice themselves for God's oneness. And this is the quality of bittul, this quality of humility, this quality of Yehudim that we mentioned above. Every Jew has this in potentia. Okay, let's pause for a moment. I'd love to hear from maybe two or three of you, how is this landing for you? How are you identifying with this? Both the overall idea and specifically as a Jew, if anybody is open to sharing. We've been discussing this idea of this selflessness and this oneness with God that Mordechai is awakening within us. And the antithesis to that is Haman and the human condition of being preoccupied with self. And I'm being a little emotionally voyeuristic to see if anybody wants to share how this is landing for them, how it's landing for you. If anybody cares to share. Go ahead.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm taking more pride in being Jewish, and I'm going to say, but yet, on the other hand, I'm not observant, and in truth, I doubt I ever will be, although it's, in one way, it's an aspiration. I guess I'm just, when I talk to myself, I say, well, yeah, I guess I'm just too spoiled. I'm too used to doing things the way I choose, rather than following Jewish tradition or God's instruction.
Good, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So let me be yet further voyeuristic. What gives you pride as a Jew? What are you taking from this that's giving you pride?
To boil it down, it's the ability to stand up to the world and not behave as they want or look at positively, but to have the strength to do, in one sense, what God has instructed us to.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, I'll comment soon. Go ahead, Murray.
One of the things that makes me most proud as a Jew is very simple, the Israeli flag. I read on Facebook, what you call irrational, the hatred of Jews. Occasionally I've tried to explain Jewish history, 3,000 years of being attacked, Israel, 77 years of it's daily, it's annually, and I realize you can't reason with them. So a lot of times when I see the hatred, my response is a heart, the Israeli flag.
So what is your pride in that?
Yeah.
What are you experiencing inside yourself?
That Jews can stand up for themselves.
And what makes you proud about that? Why is that something to be proud of?
Because historically Jews haven't been able to.
Give me more. Give me more. There's more there. Why is it important to stand up for yourself as a Jew?
Because if you don't, you'll be run over by society.
And therefore what?
And therefore you will cease to exist.
And therefore what? And so what? So what if we cease to exist? Why is it important for the Jew to exist?
Because we're Jews.
Okay, so
We have so much to offer the world. You can't repair the world if you don't exist, right?
Look at all the technology that comes from Israel today. People say, I won't use anything from Israel. Well, put your iPhone away, but who knows what technologies on your iPhone, can't use that anymore.
good.
Waze, can't use that anymore.
Good. Robert, what do you say?
I was actually with what we're talking about today, just looking at the distinction between like self and self-interest, and then the giving and doing God's will. There's some really good stuff in that.
But I think that when we break it down, I would say your Doctor, how you articulated the notion that you're proud of who you are, and yet you struggle with the notion that you won't ever fully observe. That itself, I think, is a manifestation of what we're saying here. And it's important to qualify that, because I don't think that because the Jew is the Jew, therefore all of us live a selfless life. But we have an identity within ourselves that epitomizes the ability to live a selfless life. We also have an animal soul, and we also have to struggle. But the Torah, like Ronnie said, the Torah is the conscience of the world. And we are the keepers of that. So we do need to keep working at it, even if we may never fully get there, but we need to keep working at that. And I would say, Murray, that the pride that you have as a Jew is actually a super rational pride. As much as we want to talk about self-determination and the ability to stand up for ourselves and so on, I think I mentioned this last class or 2 classes ago, the idea that when do we begin to mature? We begin to mature when we stop identifying ourselves through the lenses of others. When I stop saying that I'm only worthwhile because my wife treats me this way, or my kids treat me that way, or I have the validation of my parents, or the validation of popular society, when we can let that go, we can begin to really mature and live life. And as long as the Jew is identifying themselves by how the world treats us or doesn't treat us, by what we have or what we don't have, we're not really mature. And it doesn't mean that once we become mature, therefore we don't have struggles anymore. But we know the struggle then is within ourselves. The struggle lives inside of ourselves. We stop looking outward to resolve the struggle, right? When we think that our worth comes from our bank account, then we spend years trying to make money or to get the nicer car, the nicer house. And if we think that our worth comes from our parents' validation, then we in a variety of different ways try to elicit that from them. Sometimes in a positive way by being codependent, and sometimes in a negative way by fighting with our parents or our siblings or our loved ones, whatever it might be. And at some point we say, whoa, I'm a worthwhile human being on account of myself. Now, why are you a worthwhile human being on account of yourself? Because you got a soul. You hear how selfless that statement really is? It sounds selfish, but if you think about it for a second, you're saying my worth is not determined by anything except for my essence. And my essence is the part of God that's within me. And God validates my existence. That's the most selfless thing that we can say. And when we can say that, then we can begin to live life. Because our struggles is inside of ourselves. We can navigate that from within. This makes sense? It's the juice of life. Yes.
I think being Jewish, the most important thing is being chosen by God. They bring the truth to the Moses law, and then when
Beautiful. Thank you.
The world.
That's right. That's what we've been chosen for. We've been chosen to be the carriers of the book, the people of the book, to carry the torch of morality and what's right and wrong. The Rebbe would often say that we may never get the love of the world or the toleration of the world, but we'll always get the respect of the world if we respect ourselves and live. We live the way the Torah wants us to. And we've seen that. We've seen that in history. You can't change the people that are evil out there. But those that are affected by this inherent hatred, when they see that we know who we are and that we live who we are, we at least get their respect. Not that we need that respect, but at least we get it.
For some reason, the person the world discovered in everything, and the new discovery. I didn't know they discovered the GPS. Who discovered it?
Yeah, so I want to say that that's all nice and good. That's all feel good. It's all feel good stuff. That the Israeli technology. The Israeli technology and the ingenuity of the IDF and all that stuff, it's all wonderful. It's all feel good. It's not the real thing. It's not the real thing. It's all important. It's all necessary. Just like, God put us in this earth and he wants us to live in the physical reality, but that's not really what it's about. It's a byproduct. What it's really all about is the fact that we are God's people and we have that worth. The ability to influence the world through technology and stuff like that, it's great. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's all good. But that's not the real thing. Now, to the doctor's point, we'll continue in the middle of 53. And I don't mean to present you as what we're about to say, but the inner struggle. She says that even the most unworthy Jews are prepared to actually sacrifice their lives. I shouldn't have even said that. It's not nice. What I meant to say is that those that judge themselves for not living fully according to the Torah, also have that ability to have that selflessness. That's the point. You don't have to be fully observant to have the selflessness because it's who you are at your core. And you know how we know this? Because the haters, don't distinguish between those that are observant and not. They'll kill all of us in a second, whether we keep Shabbos and kosher or we don't. Because it's not your observance that's ultimately what irks them. It's the very essence of who you are. You epitomize, as a Jew, you epitomize this connection to God, this transcendent connection. So every Jew has that ability. So as not to be separated from God's oneness to any degree. Yes. Kal means, yeah, kal, the word kal means light. You might say in English terminology, the biggest lightweight, right? But light meaning that they don't take Jewish observance seriously. They're light about it. So it's used in Talmudic language. A kal is someone who's very superficial. They live a very their relationship to the outward manifestation of their relationship to God is very light. It's not serious. Yeah, because that's its intention. Its intention is in Talmudic language is usually referred to someone who's we would say is not a good person.
Because of misdeeds or just not examining?
Because of misdeeds. Because of misdeeds.
I'm just not sincere, go black and
So there's, like everything in life, there's a gray area, right? There's everything in between. There's the ideal that we're extrapolating from all this, but the ideal is also, I'm going to say this again because I think it's both the human condition, it's also societal, it's also just the way people are, where we hear a profound idea and we say to ourselves that the ideal is the only way to be, and if we're not living the ideal, then it's all worthless. You don't understand what I'm saying? We say, oh, I need to be a good person, and a good person is A, B, and C, and if I'm not doing that, it's all worthless. But it's not true. It's not true. Is this act a good act? And do it. The fact that yesterday you didn't do it and tomorrow you might not do it doesn't make a difference. Right now, this is a good act, do it. Can you be selfless in this moment? And what happens is when we set the bar so high that it's everything or nothing, it becomes nothing. So the Alter Rebbe here is going to the extreme. He's saying even a Kal Shebakalim, even the greatest lightweight. And again, by the way, you look around the world, we saw this in the last 18 months. People who are distant from Judaism, big prominent people who've lived their lives completely disconnected from Judaism. Let's see if I'm going to play something for you. I can find it real quickly.
Finish your sentence.
Even those people have demonstrated unbelievable Jewish identity. And they didn't become observant. They haven't become observant. They just have embraced their Jewish identity.
You see, Rabbi, the Jews are successful for two reasons.
Yeah.
It could be for other things, but one of them is the Torah, being the foundation of Judaism. And you have a whole, system around it. And then the other one is anti-Semitism. Which forces you back into the Torah.
Unfortunately.
Which is a good thing, I suppose. Reinforces the Torah in your life with a little bit less of it.
Yeah. Could be a little less.
Give me a second. It's worth finding this. I was blown away when I heard this.
It's amazing. So interview with one of these kids in the college campus. And the interviewer was asking about a Palestinian demonstration. The interviewer asked, can you locate Palestine, Gaza on the map? I have no idea where it was. It's not important. It's important to be in this middle. Who, what, where, doesn't matter. Amazing.
Here. Okay, let's see if you can hear this.
I talk about Judaism and I look at comments, they're like, when are you gonna get over this Jew stuff? And I never go down, and I'm like, this is so great that I end up with no followers at all because I talk about God and anti-Semitism and Judaism. That's my new goal.
Where does passion come from to proudly to defend your Jewishness? There's a lot of people that would not be doing that in your position.
Well, because they don't know what it is.
So what is
They
it?
think it's eating a bagel. It's life. Judaism is life itself. Torah is life itself. And I live in Torah and for Torah, and that's it.
How does that present itself on a day-to-day?
Praying, writing, talking, learning, talking to other students, trying to hear something new and trying to hear it said better and wondering why more aren't interested. You know, since October 7th, I think it was an awakening and people are like, something else is going on. When I talk about Judaism and I look at my comments, they're like, when are you gonna get over this Jews?
Who's that? Roseanne Barr, yeah.
So that bar.
That's Roseanne Barr. Is that mind-blowing?
Plugging in since October.
Yeah, yeah. Is that unbelievable? And what does she say? What is Judaism? It's not eating a bagel. She said it's life itself. It's Torah. It's prayer. It's an unbelievable thing, right? So I don't think she's Shomer Shabbos or keeps kosher, but she identifies as a Jew and understands enough. It touches her deeply enough to push her to whether it's Torah study or prayer or wherever it shows up. But even just the ability to proclaim, I am a Jew with pride, that's coming from the soul. That's Mordechai wakens that up inside of us. So, what do they say? The perfection is the something to good?
Best be the enemy of the good.
Something like that, right? So if I can't do all of it, I'm not going to do any of it. You're missing the point. What's that? Something, yeah, same idea that if we get stuck on that, we're missing the point. The point is that I am a part of God. And that part of God inside of me has the ability to live selflessly. Does it mean I will live selflessly? No, not necessarily collectively, like in totality, but I have moments where I can live selflessly. I can make a choice in a moment in this situation to not do what's in my interest, but to do what's in God's interest. In the case of Mordechai and the Jews, it was for 1 year. For the entire year, they lived selflessly. That was a miracle. That was an empowerment from Mordechai. But we have that ability to live that at least in moments in our lives. And he continues, Umasha over Shara Veiros, middle of 53, at the bottom of 53, the fact that one commits other transgressions, that doesn't mean that that's your identity. Because the spirit of foolishness enters into a person and causes them to err. The Alter Rebbe elaborates this in the book of Tanya, that it's a foolish thing that we say to ourselves that, oh, I can do this sin and I won't be disconnected from God. Right? When it comes to the big ones, if you want me to deny my Jewishness or you want me to worship another God, no, I can never do that. Why? Because you can't do that and still believe for yourself that you're connected to God. Right? I can't deny God and still believe that I'm connected to God. But I can do a minor sin or even not so minor sin and say, that one, I'll still be connected. God will be okay with that. Whatever stories we tell ourselves. But that's not our true identity. We have a spirit of foolishness that enters into us. But our identity, tell the Jew to deny their Jewishness, doesn't work. To quote Rosie, as we just did, the Alter Rebbe says, as it says in the verse, to love God your God, to love God your Lord, because he is your life. Judaism is life itself, right? That's who we are. That's our identity. You can't ignore that. You can't say that this is a rationale for self-sacrifice because the verse says, because he is your life. And what are you doing when you give up your life? You're throwing your life away. So it doesn't mean that because that our Jewish identity is our life in a conventional way. Because if it was our life and you're giving up your life, then you're throwing your life away. When we say, when Rosie says it's life itself, she doesn't mean my life, the heart that's beating inside of me. It's the very essence of life, the concept of vitality. What's vital in existence in all of the cosmos? It's God. That's what my Judaism is. Doesn't mean the fact that my heart is beating. It's the very essence of all of existence is life. And that's God. And that's Judaism. Because self-sacrifice is a transcendent act. It's a super rational act. Practically, that's where self-sacrifice comes from. It comes from a transcendent place. It's not a logical thing. If you want to talk logic, the logical thing is that when someone comes to you and says, by the way, there are three big sins that we're not allowed to transgress. All the other 610 commandments, if we are given the choice to violate the commandment or to give up our life, we have to violate the commandment. So somebody puts a gun to your head and says, eat this pork, or I'll kill you, you have to eat the pork. Someone says, violate the Shabbos, or I'll kill you, you have to violate the Shabbos. But if somebody comes to you and says, violate this prohibition against this forbidden relationship, or take the life of another person, you have to give up your life. And those two, you have to give up your life because for separate reasons. To take another life, why is your life more important than theirs? So you're not allowed to give up your life. You're not allowed to take away another person's life so that you can live. And with forbidden relationships, God created a structure in his world, and we're not allowed to interfere with that structure, which is illicit relationships. But the third one, which is worship this other God, or I'll kill you, you have to let your life be taken. Why? Because life itself, the very essence of life, is God. And if you deny that, then you deny the very essence of life. So you say, if it's about my life, then it would make sense, worship the idol so that you can live to serve God. But it's not about my life. It's about life. It's about life itself. The very essence of everything is defined by God. And if I'm denying that, I'm denying the very essence of everything. So there's no place. And by the way, that's not a rational thing. You can't explain God. If you can explain God, then you have a rational reason not to worship the idol. But because you can't explain God, so therefore, the act of submission to God in allowing your life to be taken is a selfless event. It's a transcendent, it's a super rational event. Now, if we dial that back down, if we can condense that into this moment and the act that's in front of me, and we have the wherewithal to pause and say, okay, I'm about to transgress this sin. Why is this a sin? Because God told me not to do it. What's the essence of life? It's God. So in doing this sin, I'm denying God. And we won't sin. Because I'm moving into that place of the soul that recognizes the essence of everything. Now, we don't anchor ourselves enough to do that. But there are practices that we can engage in to help us center ourselves when we encounter choice. And as I've often said, that's the concept in the AA world of a spiritual practice, right? If you wake up in the morning and you say Moda'ani and you wash your hands and you say your morning blessings and you wrap your tefillin and you kiss the mezuzah and you bring a consciousness of God into your life, it's much easier when you encounter a choice to pause and say, what does God want? What does God want from me here? If you don't nurture that, then you're only in your animal space, and the animal is going to react. It's going to do what is in its own interest. Yes.
The second two, like the three that I got, when we say illicit relationships, what do you mean?
So illicit relationships are anything the Torah prohibits. So it's incestual relationships. It's having an affair with a married woman. So all of these relationships. We're actually learning in Maimonides the laws about the forbidden relationship. We actually read it in the Torah yesterday in both of the Torah portions. So the Torah enumerates all the prohibited relationships. You're not allowed to have a relationship with your relations, sexual relations with a daughter, with a mother, with an aunt. There's all these forbidden relationships. Why? Because there's an order to creation, and obviously human beings are a primary part of that order, and the order is supposed to go a certain way. And when one has a forbidden relationship, you're interfering with that order. It's the very fabric of existence is the nature of the human relationship. And when we engage in a forbidden relationship, we cause the order, which is part of God's master plan for us human beings in this physical reality, to be able to uncover the godliness in the world. We mess that up. And therefore, one has to sacrifice themselves. In truth, this is true about any sin. But when I do something, when an individual would eat non-kosher food, for example, do they mess up the fabric of all of existence? In this moment, in this act, they are. But it's an act that directly impacts them or the individual that they're transgressing with. I steal money from someone, so it's me and that person. But in relationships, it's out of your control. It gets a life of its own. You bring a human being into this world who then has a life of their own and then it expands and goes on so forth. Reproduction is the greatest manifestation of God's infiniteness in this world. So interfering with that is interfering with the very essence of existence. But it's not about God. It's about God's plan, but it's not about God. Whereas worshiping of another God is about God. All right, enough to keep you going for a week. Next week, we're going to start 15 minutes earlier, and we're going to be studying upstairs because we have our year-end Hebrew school graduation.